Thank you. Denise Chong, welcome. We're very happy to have you here tonight in our John Adams Institute lecture program, which is, by the way, the last lecture of the year 2000. I would also like to extend a special welcome to the officials, the Canadian Embassy, the chargé d'affaires, Simon Doyon. Waar is Simon nou opeens? He'll be back in a minute? Okay. And to Marcel Laumann, to Walter Hughes, and Melanie Termeulen. The embassy has worked hard together with Prometheus Bert Bakker and Penguin Books Benelux to help make this event possible. I'd like to thank them all. My name is Anne Wertheim and I'm the director of the John Adams Institute. Throughout the year, our institute organizes some 11 lectures. Here comes the chargé d'affaires. We organize some 11 lectures per year, mainly with American men and women of the arts and letters, as well as celebrated specialists in other fields. Although Ms. Chong is not American, as we all know, she has written an intriguing book about a topic that is very important to American history, the Vietnam War. The evening will start with an introduction by Tracy Metz, author with NRC Handelsblad, a journalist, and lately, if I am well informed, a regular guest on Dutch talk shows. After Tracy's introduction, Denise Chong will speak for about 35 minutes, and then Tracy will open the discussion and take questions from the audience. There will be no intermission. The evening will end at around 9:30. Now, Ms. Chong mentions in her book a Dutch documentary about Kim Phuc several times. And my colleague Winfried van Veen is proud to announce that we're able to show this film tonight after the lecture. I hope you will stay to watch it with us. We only have a small screen and a television set, but it's a very interesting documentary. The documentary lasts about 30 minutes. I would also like to thank het Medisch Comité to help us borrowing this film. Tracy, may I invite you to the podium?
Good evening. Thank you for coming. This book elicited many emotions in me, some of which are not very noble. The first was jealousy, professional jealousy. What a great journalistic idea to tell the story behind the picture. I wish I'd thought of it. The second emotion was shame. I remember feeling ashamed when I first saw the picture in the early 70s. I was then 17, living in Southern California, which later in the days of the boat people would be dubbed Little Saigon because of the large South Vietnamese community there. Of course, I sang along with the protest songs and marched in the anti-war demonstrations. Luckily, I must say, at a university where, unlike Kent State, there was no National Guard armed with live ammunition. We were all very angry, very indignant, but reading this book, so many years later, I came to the painful realization that I, knew so little about what was really going on in Vietnam. I had no idea then that the girl in the picture was a victim of what is so ironically called friendly fire. That was one of the many revelations that this book brought to me, namely that the napalm was dropped by South Vietnamese pilots who had very simply made a mistake. All that Kim would endure, the pain, the nightmares, the insecurity about her scarred body, her unwanted fame, were the consequences of no more than that, a mistake. I felt ashamed anew after reading Denise Chong's book. I realized that once the war had disappeared out of the news, I had never again given a single thought to the napalm girl, to what had become of her, or to what the South Vietnamese in general were going through: repression, hunger, and of course a terrible sense of abandonment. Not that it would have helped if I'd thought about her, but I was still shocked to realize that until the boat people started coming out and reaching the rest of the world in desperate waves, Vietnam had for me more or less simply ceased to exist. I was all the more struck by a sentence in Ms. Chong's book where she says, to the Americans, Vietnam was not so much a country as a war. The book does, however, hold one consolation. Kim herself hardly knew what hit her, excuse the terminology. At one point, long after the war, the NBC correspondent who had filmed the napalm attack showed her on video the item that he had made. It was an eye-opener for her. Never before, writes Ms. Chong, had Kim considered what had happened to others caught in the napalm attack in the time elapsed before she emerged from it into the camera's eye. Those missing moments were a metaphor for her understanding of the war itself. She didn't know how it had started, who the enemy was, who was fighting whom, who was winning, or how it would or could end. She just didn't know. Once the communists found out how famous Kim was outside Vietnam, they started exploiting her in their propaganda campaign. They disrupted her study of medicine to trot her out as Exhibit A for interviews with foreign journalists. They pocketed the money that well-wishers from America sent her and left her family to starve. Kim found that there was no escaping her fame, a fame bestowed on her by fate rather than by any achievement of her own. More than once she says, "I am just the victim. I was just a child. I didn't do anything wrong. I don't want to be chosen. I don't want it anymore." She didn't want it anymore, and she fled to Canada at the age of 29. She wanted to build a new life, to escape not only from the regime, but also from this burden of fame that she had taken with her since she was 9. We now know that the burden has accompanied her in her new life. You wonder whether Kim will ever be able to get away from the role of professional victim. It has literally given her a profession as Goodwill Ambassador for UNESCO. But this book finally also elicited another emotion, and that is admiration. I admired Denise Chong for this achievement. I admire the way she intertwines the large scale of global politics in that turbulent time with the small scale of one family's vicissitudes. She went to Vietnam and spoke with Kim's family and friends, with the people whose story had never yet been told, even though the political situation there is still such that she refrains from naming many names for fear of reprisal. I am convinced that this very human approach will make the war and its consequences more accessible and more meaningful to the average reader, to us, than a bookcase full of history books. The war already found its icon in Kim. Now we know that the icon was also a person. We now also know that the girl in the picture is not just a victim, she is a survivor. Ms. Chong?
Good evening. This is my second time promoting a book in Amsterdam, and I have to thank my publisher, Prometheus, for that, because they published my first book, and it's through them publishing my second book that I am into the embrace of Anna Wertheim, who I know she's feeling, in Canada we say under the weather. I don't know if that's an expression here. But I know you have the flu. And I said to myself today as I went back to the hotel, I thought, I can barely keep up with her when she's sick, so I don't know when she's well. But thank you, Anna, for inviting me. And Tracy, it's a privilege to have a journalist moderate this evening, because one of the pleasures of having written this book is that I met really American journalists who were really the who's who of American journalism. Because as one of them, David Halberstam, said, Vietnam, the conflict, would form the spine of their professional careers. And then Horst Faust, the editor who put this picture on the wire, because it almost didn't make it, because the rule in head office in New York was no frontal nudity. Horst Faust puts the picture on the wire and said to me that Vietnam, the conflict, was really a glory days for photojournalism. And he predicted that years and years from now, people will return to that period to study it as a period of the making of journalism. I'm going to quote Johnny Apple from the New York Times, whose words really stuck in my mind. He said of pictures, he said that pictures are the seed that prepare the ground for truth. I got a call in 1995 from my publisher, and I remember I was standing at the stove, I was cooking dinner, and picked up the phone, and my publisher in Canada said to me, "Do you remember the famous photo from the Vietnam War, the little girl running naked?" Well, immediately the image just flooded my mind. She lived in Canada. She had defected 3 years earlier. She had been studying in Cuba, had married a North Vietnamese, Kim is South Vietnamese. The regime had allowed them to honeymoon in Moscow, and the plane returning from Moscow to Havana refueled in Canada, and they stepped off. That's how they ended up in Canada. My publisher had bought her book rights. Was I interested in pursuing a book? The Kim that I met in early 1995, I went to Toronto, I live in Ottawa. I went to an older Chinatown of Toronto with congested streets, crowded houses. She lived in the second floor of a duplex. She was living on welfare. She was going to the food bank. She sent her husband out on garbage collection days once a week to scavenge for broken furniture. So the Kim I met had sold her book rights because, in essence, she needed a meal ticket. I begin to interview Kim to decide if I want to write this book, and then within days, the long lens of a tabloid photographer from the Daily Mail on Sunday finds her on this Toronto street and splashes the story that goes around the world. Famous victim of war in hiding, living in hiding in the West. So this would be my routine when I would go to interview Kim. I would phone, arrange a time to meet her that morning, and then I would ring the buzzer on the door, and then I would back up to the sidewalk where I knew I was in plain view. And I would know, though the average passerby would not, that the curtain upstairs would move ever so slightly. She'd confirm I was there. I'd go back to the door, and then I'd hear her feet clatter down the staircase, and she would admit me. Invariably, she'd be wearing the same turquoise dressing gown that I'd left her in at 6 o'clock the night before. She'd still have it on. She had never even left the house. So the subject that I find in 1995 is a frightened woman. She's afraid as much of the regime that she had defected from as she is of the media. Because once that story splashes around the world, a media feeding frenzy ensues. But though she had defected 3 years earlier from Vietnam, the person I find is living in a little cup almost, and it's still communistic. So as a writer, it's all I can do to get her to just peer over the edge, and then much less begin to spill her memories to me. How was I to write this book? In the end, as a writer sweats blood over this question, in the end, what I came to realize as the book began to take shape in my mind was that I realized I live in the West. I live in a place that is safe. I live really without any notion of fear. To do this book, I found what would happen is I would run headlong between her sensibilities and mine, my Western sensibilities and hers coming from a communist country. And to write the book, I would have to turn on its head every notion that I had about what is fear, what is suffering. That if I turned that topsy-turvy and then out of that, I knew I could fashion a book. Well, how does the story begin? In 1972, America had been in Vietnam for more than a decade. The anti-war protests had taken hold. Americans wanted out of Vietnam. They wanted the conflict to end for America. They just wanted their boys home. Enough body bags had come home. On the morning of June 8th, 1972, the Foreign Press Corps in Saigon, and by now they're a dwindling lot, because the war, the glory days of the war, covering the war, have really gone. Journalists have moved on thinking the conflict won't end. And it's very hard to get a story in the newspaper, much less on the front pages. The conflict has slipped to the back pages. So the journalists in Saigon exchanged rumor about where that day's fighting is. And the war was such that you could commute from Saigon to cover it and then be back in Saigon before nightfall. They hear that up Route 1, near the village of Trang Bang, there's been a firefight going on. And they've heard this term hundreds of times in the war. The Viet Cong come in from the jungle up through their tunnels, typically come up at a village along Route 1, undertake an action that cuts the highway because they're trying to cut traffic and communication in and out of the capital. And then when they decide, they back through their tunnels and retreat back into the jungle. But the journalists have heard this is the third day of the firefight. So something more is going on. So they head up Route 1, and I'm talking New York Times, Time, Life, Newsweek, the wire services, television, BBC, NBC, ITN. And they see in the distance Trang Bang because they can tell the smoke over the town. There's fighting and bombing going on. They come to concertina barbed wire stretched across the highway. It's a roadblock. 3 days of traffic are blocked. The journalists go as far as they can and park themselves on the highway, and in the distance they can see a temple. They don't know that women and children are hiding in that temple. All morning long, the journalists watch bombing runs going on, because typically when Viet Cong were entrenched, the South Vietnamese, who were known for their reputation they didn't want to fight, would call in airstrikes. During the war, these airstrikes were done in tandem. A first plane would come in and drop what were called hard bombs, and these are explosives, hard explosives, which would blow the cover off a bunker. The second plane would be loaded with napalm. Napalm is jellied gasoline. you add soap and various acids and incendiary agents to napalm, it explodes and it spills into the area that has been exposed by the hard bombs. The soap makes it syrupy, so it sticks. It burns at 1200 degrees. Water boils at 100. So the napalm was meant to smother, if not incinerate, anything still alive. Well, the journalists take these pictures all morning, but they've got these pictures in their archives as well, from years of covering the war. Around noontime, it begins to rain. And it's a tropical rain in the summer and early summer months. And it gets heavier and heavier, and the cloud cover gets lower and lower. So there's silence. The bombing runs have stopped. But the journalists are already beginning to look at their watches, because there was one rule during the Vietnam War, which was that you could do what you liked by day, but the moment the sun set, and in Southeast Asia, it sets like a blind being pulled down. The hour of darkness belongs to the Viet Cong. So the journalists know they have to hightail it back to Saigon and be off the road before dark. Late that morning, the journalists noticed the darkening skies. The clouds had formed a low-lying blanket. The typical afternoon downpour of the wettest summer months began. The photographers and television cameramen covered their equipment with army-issue rain ponchos, bought in Saigon markets. The photographers cast about to see if anyone was thinking about calling it a day. The cloud cover would mean a halt in airstrikes, and therefore ground assaults. What do you think today's picture is? They compared notes. Refugees on the road, people fleeing the town. Maybe I'll go early today. What time? Some said 1, others 2 at the latest. Talk turned to where to go tomorrow for pictures. Nikut, the photographer, took from his camera bag his lunch of French cheese and a baguette sandwich. He decided that he'd aim to leave by 2 because of the heavy refugee traffic. 1 o'clock came and went without a break in the cloud cover. Some of his colleagues left, presuming that the communists and the Viet Cong would also take advantage of the weather to retreat and leave the town. The rain continued. A soldier began washing his jeep, taking pails of water from the stream. Now this is inside the temple that they can see in the distance. The children inside the temple outbuilding, enlivened by food in their tummies, were running around. During the last 3 days, Kim Phuc had taken Auntie Anne's second child under her wing. The chubby 3-year-old Dan was her favorite cousin. There was sudden excitement when a black bird found its way into the building. Dan chased it, snatching it out of the air. Adult voices cried out in alarm. "Don't touch it! Let it go! Dan, let it go!" Kim Phuc called out to her cousin. The boy released the bird, but was disconsolate about losing a plaything. Even as the bird found its way outside, the adults were shaking their heads. A bird inside is bad luck. Suddenly after lunch, the sun peeks out. The sky, though, is smudged and dirty, and the reporters hear a drone of an airplane. A first plane comes in and drops hard bombs. They turn out to be duds. Nonetheless, a second plane comes in. Soldiers guarding the women and children in the temple mistake the smoke markers being dropped, thinking the temple is about to be bombed, and send the women and children running for their lives, the soldiers scrambling to get ahead of them in panic. And in a war without a front, there was one rule of engagement that the Americans developed, and that was that civilians were not fair game unless they were running. If they were running, they could be deemed to be Viet Cong. So in that smudged, dirty sky, the pilot sees the figures and drops the napalm. The first group of survivors runs out, and among them is the chubby 3-year-old Dan. He's badly charred. He's in the arms of Kim's grandmother. The photographers snap away. They exhaust their film. So that a minute and a half later, when the second group of survivors runs out, Kim Phuc among them, only one photographer, Nikud, has one frame left in his camera. So now I'm going to read, it's 2 days later. Kim Phuc has gone up the road and not even the parents know where she is. On the afternoon of June 9th, a mother arrived at an outbuilding of Saigon's First Children's Hospital for her daily vigil at her son's deathbed. Badly burned from firecrackers he'd found left over from Tet celebrations, he lay unconscious. The mother saw that he had company, a girl, also badly burned. The small room was stifling, though the louvered shutters on the windows were open. The woman moved from one cot to the other, fanning each child in turn, shooing the flies from their faces. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness. "Dan," she would cry out. "Dan, wait for me, I'll go with you." That evening, the woman took an offering of fruit to her pagoda and prayed to Buddha that the family of the girl would come to see their dying child on her way. On June 10th, Tung and Nu, which are Kim's parents, continued on foot to Saigon. At the Cho-Ray Hospital, they drew another blank and were told to try Saigon's First Children's Hospital. By then it was dark. The couple spent a second night outdoors, this time on a stone bench. The next day they walked across town to their third hospital in as many days and were met with the same denials that their daughter had been admitted. Before they could admit defeat and begin a search of the city's morgues, Tung and Nu decided they had to conduct a search of this last hospital themselves. The 8-story building had several wings. Floor by floor, corridor by corridor, room by room, they sorted patients from crowds of relatives, bathing them, changing dressings, feeding them. In desperation, they lifted cast-aside bedding and looked under piles of shoes outside each room, as if their daughter, untended, might have been pushed aside there. After several hours, they found themselves back on the ground floor. They sat, exhausted and spent. A cleaner came by. He set down his pail of water and began crisscrossing the floor with his mop, working his way from one side of the large reception area to the other. When he was done, he began mopping a corridor. Tung approached the cleaner. "Excuse me, did you see a young girl brought here who was burned very badly? It would have been 3 days ago. Maybe she did not survive?" The cleaner stood his mop in his pail and beckoned Tung and Nu to follow him to an outer corridor. Outside, he pointed to a small outbuilding with louvered shuttered windows and clapboard walls peeling and bleached by the sun. "That room," he said, "is for children who will die." So it was chance that Nikud got that photograph. It was chance that the picture was taken and therefore it would save her life. It was chance that Kim survived. I knew right away that, yes, Kim was a victim. And so what is victimhood? in war. And I remember was walking along the Vietnam Wall Memorial in Washington with its 58,000 names. And I remember thinking to myself, for every one of those names, chance has gone badly wrong. And so I thought, all right, this book is about victimhood. It will explore what war does to the ordinary civilian. And Kim is a child, so this is about to her family. But this was different. This was no ordinary war, because this is a war where friend and foe look alike, except for the Americans. So Kim leads a life where she is a child and she's in fact protected by ignorance. Her parents don't tell their children what happens because children may betray the parents to either the Viet Cong side or the government side. So not until Kim actually has my book in hand does she find out, and she's in disbelief, that by night, she's sleeping in her bed in the big house in her village. She doesn't know that by night the Viet Cong knock on the door and they bring wounded Viet Cong and they say to her mother, "We have a parcel for you to keep." And the parcel, the wounded Viet Cong, goes into the bomb shelter, and the parents go out by night to supply medicine and bandages. Or that the Viet Cong knock on the door and invite Kim's eldest sister, who's a teacher who can read and write. They invite her to go out to the forest to read aloud the execution orders for condemned prisoners. And Kim didn't know that, till she reads the book, that her mother was once arrested and tortured because a bicycle frame packed with explosives went off at her mother's noodle shop and it killed a South Vietnamese official. It was in Vietnam that I found an expression that I thought so captured what the peasant went through in this war. And it was that their lives were caught between the sticky rice and the bean. So you take a pile of glutinous white rice grains and a pile of black beans, and you put them in a banana leaf and you mix it up. You fold up the banana leaf and you steam it. And then when you open up the leaf, you can see the white of the rice and the black of the bean, but in the stickiness, you cannot separate it. And that was their life between day and night, between the government side and the Viet Cong. I'm going to talk about some of my writerly challenges in writing this book. Could I get the taste of war and the taste of suffering? Could I understand what drove Kim to defect? You know, I can't imagine knowing any Canadian who would defect. Could I, from the West, understand that? And again, it was going to Vietnam that helped me turn these things on its head from what I know living in the West. To my surprise, I go to Vietnam in 1996. It's more than 20 years on after the end of the war. I find a culture of the victor and the vanquished. You're either on the losing side of the war or the winning side of the war. I go to Vietnam clandestinely. I conduct all my research in secret and at great risk. Because the moment Kim defected, the famous picture is stripped from every museum in Vietnam. You will not find it there today. And through the diplomatic grapevine, I heard she was persona non grata. I still shake when I read my file in my computer where it was my advice file before I went to Vietnam. I took advice from the likes of journalists like Peter Arnett. I took most of my advice from South Vietnamese about how I should conduct my research in Vietnam. And my file says things like, assume the family is blacklisted. Assume telephone calls are monitored. Assume correspondence is read. When you set up your first meeting and you meet the family, do not linger. Set the next appointment. Don't stay long enough to arouse neighborhood suspicions and someone reporting you. Never interview in the same place twice. So, it's such a stark difference to be standing at a microphone in a public hall and talking about this with my notes. And what did I do in my research? I was always in the back of a busy storefront. I made sure it was windowless so no one could hear. I made sure that the Saigon calamity was around me so that people wouldn't hear. And I'm on the move. I'm never staying long in one place. So had I not tasted that fear and seen in people who I interviewed as well, their lower lip would still quiver when they talked about the war. They couldn't bring themselves even, when they got to the word Viet Cong, to voice the word aloud. They would mouth it. Could I understand when Kim would say to me in my weeks of research and months and years of research with her, a constant refrain I heard was, I suffer, I suffer, I suffer so much. Well, I could understand physical suffering. And certainly when she was comfortable enough with me that I knew one day when she showed up in something sleeveless, I could see just the frozen rivers of scar tissue. I could see. I read medical journals. I talked to doctors and nurses. I understood that with that severity of a burn, when you lose the skin, well, you first of all lose blood and plasma and body protein, so you weaken every internal organ because of infection. But when you lose that much skin, you have to have skin grafts. Skin grafts don't have pores, don't have hair follicles, so you can't control your body temperature. Grafted skin hardens over time into like an armor-like plate. So yes, I could understand the physical suffering, but I also knew that she had had the best of medical care. So what did this mean, suffering? I suffer so much. Her suffering came in 1982 when she's discovered as the girl in the picture. When Western journalists come back to do stories on Vietnam, they want the regime to find the girl in the picture. The regime searches for a year and a half. They are in disbelief when they find this smiling 20-year-old. They say, "You are the girl in the picture?" And she understands. She simply draws up her left sleeves, and they are convinced. But what happens? Yes, she's trotted out for journalist after journalist, literally hundreds of interviews, told what to say. She would say, "I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm a medical student in Saigon. I'm studying to become a doctor, my dream." In reality, she was desperately unhappy, near suicidal. She was penniless. She couldn't even afford ice for her back, which you need in the sticky Saigon heat to cool her body down. She couldn't even afford much less a tablet of painkiller. She wasn't studying medicine in Saigon. She wasn't studying anything at all because she had been yanked from school so that she could be at the beck and call of the regime. So that's when I knew this is suffering that we in the West can't and don't know, which is state control, state repression, humiliation, smiling on the outside to mask everything you feel inside. My greatest writerly challenge was this. When I first began to talk to Kim, and I would probe, she would say, answer me by saying, "Oh, that wasn't God's will. That wasn't God's way. God hadn't opened the door yet." She's holds her faith very deeply. But I had to, as the writer, I had to go break past that submission of will. Now I'll tell a tale. In my just grappling with this, I went to talk to the documentary filmmaker who'd made a story about Kim's life. And I said, "How are you dealing with that?" And the filmmaker said to me, "Well, I'm doing it in the editing room. It's hard, but just before the end of the sentence, just before she says, 'Thanks God,' I'd clip it." So I thought, well, no, there must be something else here. I found, as I asked myself already, what is suffering, that the more I wound the thread of faith and religion in the story, the more the power of the picture itself began to come into focus. Because when I asked, what is suffering, it led me to ask, how much is it the human condition to suffer? Is that sufficient? Or is it human nature to seek relief, to find some kind of redemption? So Kim converts from her family's religion to Christianity when she's in Vietnam. And why? Because Christianity offered her redemption within her lifetime. Her family's religion said, you don't have redemption because now's not your time. Maybe not this lifetime, maybe not the next, but maybe the next. But no, because her suffering is too great. It's the same redemption that was revealed in either torment from the experience of the war or the aftermath of war, to a feeling of wrongdoing or guilt even that this is what man does to man in war, that at the uppermost reaches of the Vietnamese government, of Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, would make up for the wrongs of the regime and using Kim as a propaganda pawn by sending her out of the reach of foreign journalists, and he thinks, American foreign journalists, Cuba, I'll send you to Cuba. And it's that relief from that torment that a German journalist, Perry Kretz from Stern magazine, comes back to Vietnam a decade later because he says, all right, I stood by when I saw it, when I first met her, but now I should make up for that wrongdoing and I should find her medical care. And he brings her to Germany. But the greatest example of this need for redemption is the person I put in the book called John Plummer. He's an American radio operator. He's in a Bin Hoa air base outside Saigon. And he was involved in that chain of radio command that day when the napalm strike was called in over Trang Bang. And for 20 years, every time he saw this picture, he would say to himself, I did it. He meets Kim, it's very public, at the Vietnam Wall Memorial. But word has already got to Kim that there's an American commander who was responsible for the bombing, and he wants to meet you, but he's too scared to come forward. And Kim has made this speech at the wall, and she's being hustled to the police cruiser when someone taps her on the shoulder and says, you know the man who ordered the bombing, the one you've been wanting to meet? She says, yes. And they say, he's right behind you. She turns. John Plummer looks in Kim's face and says, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. They fall into each other's arms, and Kim says, I forgive, I forgive. Well, with forgiveness, there's hope of a future. And with the hope of a future, there's hope of redemption. So let me go back to the long lens of the tabloid photographer. I admit to misgivings. In my routine, when I would knock on the door, retreat to the sidewalk, greet Kim in the turquoise nightgown, dressing gown, day after day, I said to myself, I feel like a stalker. Am I not stalking this image myself? And I said to myself, well, what about Kim's agent, whom I was negotiating with about the book? Well, what about the cadre, the communist cadre in her home province, who when foreign journalists would come would take the Marlboro cigarettes and say, these are not for your family, these are for the people? Or what about the foreign journalist who Kim once dared to ask, why? Why all this attention for me, just one little picture? And the journalist answers, because you're hot news, an expression she doesn't understand. I got a phone call very late one night in Ottawa when I was working on the book. And it's a voice I don't recognize, and a name I don't recognize. And she says to me, "I'm calling from Reverend Chuck Colson's office." And I'm thinking, I live in Ottawa, Reverend Chuck Colson, and I can't make the connection. And I blurt out, I say, "Watergate?" Chuck Colson was one of the Watergate burglars. And she says to me, "Reverend Chuck Colson," this is his new incarnation, "is doing a book about forgiveness and would like to include Kim Phuc in it." I'm going to conclude with this passage. "It's a picture that doesn't rest," says Horst Vost, when asked to comment on its enduring power. He explains his own reaction when he first saw it, which decided him on the need to bring it to the public. "Pain keeps you conscious," he says. In the voiceless cry of the girl in the picture is the silence of guilt, of public and private flaws. War, any war, not just the Vietnam War, has dimensions of moral ambiguity. The picture is itself ambiguous. Who or what the girl is running from is unclear. The extent of her burns is not evident, and whether she will live or die is an unknown. But the state of anxiety conveyed by the camera's eye concentrates the minds of us, the viewers, simultaneously dispatching each of us into our own personal history of darkness. We privately flail at our human limitations, failings, and self-indulgence in the face of chaos and wrongdoing of war. We who live in places that are safe feel chained by our individual helplessness to aid those who live in places that are not. None of us is without our flaws, but our hope is that we can be flawed, yet still have a worthiness of character. We feel that when we are forgiven. Forgiveness was what the most famous victim of the Vietnam War, Kim Phuc, had to give. The cycle of war repeats and repeats. The girl in the picture is ever running. Kim Phuc will always be the girl in the picture. Thank you very much.
That you will feel inspired to ask questions of Denise Chong. This may be the only occasion you get, and I would say, don't let it slip away. We'll do our interview, but I wanted to tell you this so that you can let your mind work while we talk, and after a little bit, please do feel free. Do take the opportunity. Denise, if I'm not mistaken, you're an economist by training.
I never
How
know
have you come to this?
Well, I never know if I should apologize for that. Is this mic on? Yes.
Is
this mic
does it
on?
work? Okay.
Yes. Although I actually have some fellow economists in the audience, so maybe I won't apologize.
You were actually a senior advisor to Trudeau.
Yes. In a funny way, I actually do think that has helped my writing. I do think that.
Oh.
Because...
Oh, didn't mean to sound so surprised.
Because, you know, I learned that when I did my family memoir, which is called The Concubine's Daughters here, but The Concubine's Children.
Which has also been translated, may I say, De Dochters van de Concubine.
All right. You know, my grandmother was a tea house waitress, the lowest rung of the ladder in Chinatown, much less Canadian society. And my grandmother would take the one metal trunk and take my mother from rooming house to rooming house. My grandparents separated. I only ever knew my grandparents in rooming houses, and when they died, everything went the way of the pawn shop. So I learned from doing my family memoir that I could have written my story as just their story, just like I could have written Kim's story in a very isolated way. and I would have portrayed my own family as a very dysfunctional family. But what happens, and I think this is true of good memoir and good biography, it should also reveal the social context. So when I began, let's take my grandmother, I began to fit in the pieces around my grandmother's life. That Chinatowns had ratios of men to women of 25-1, that you couldn't take a step outside the Chinatown without being shunned by the wider society, that China was the sick man of Asia, that middlemen had to translate for everything that the Chinese community had to know. So what is revealed, you're not just giving the reader social history as sort of a side package. What happens when you fit those pieces in around your life, or a life? What is revealed is actually the temperament of the person themselves. That's when character is revealed. Because it's when you're seeing yourself up against history, that's when you see whether someone is strong or weak or gives in or perseveres or has certain follies. It's temperament that is revealed. So when I fit the war in around Kim's life, what is revealed is not only temperament of her, but she's a victim. It reveals the temperament even of the Vietnamese society itself and of the American psyche. So I think that the social context, I think that's the economist in me coming out, I actually think it's very revealing.
Were you involved in any way, or as a Canadian, aware of what a grip the Vietnam War had on America? I don't know if everyone here knows that Canada was involved to the extent that a lot of American young men who didn't want to go to Vietnam dodged the draft by going to Canada. What was there for you to the Vietnam War aside from draft dodgers?
Well, I was 19 when this picture was taken, so certainly I'm aware of that era of campus protests in the U.S., of knowing families who knew families who took in a distant cousin who was a draft dodger. So there was that connection, but I think there was always the sense, and I heard this said today among people in Amsterdam, there was a sense, a kind of a false pride that, well, that's not our war. So that, therefore, what is tearing apart the social fabric of America that led to Watergate, on and on and on, it wasn't tainting us. But I know that the Vietnam War shaped my generation, and it continues
also
to
in
shape.
Canada.
Yes, I think it does, because it was a domino effect that led to so much more. It defined the way modern journalism is. It explains U.S. policy. I mean, even today, Vietnam enters the vocabulary, but it's not the country. It's we can't intervene in Kosovo. That could be another Vietnam. So it can, even those who are born after the picture, that war. And it, especially since it's an unfinished chapter in America's history, will continue to exert its influence.
Is there a difference in the way that Americans react to the picture and the way that Vietnamese react?
Well, Nikut, the photographer, has had a steady stream of veterans who find their way to his door in Monterey, California. They knock on his door and they say, "Nikut, I just want to thank you for taking the picture. Your picture stopped the war." So Americans see this picture that finally, the torment was over. It was a war that we wanted out of, and America withdrew shortly after that. But no, it ended for Americans. But the war would go on for another 3 years. It's just that Vietnamese killing other Vietnamese never made it to the pages of American newspapers. when I talk about the picture to South Vietnamese, they will weep. They will avert their eyes at this picture. And why? They say, this picture lost the war for us. And 2 decades on, I discover, as I'm pursuing this story, that Kim is in Canada. She's defected to the West, but there's a great suspicion among the South Vietnamese community abroad, because they think, why has she taken so long to defect? You know, we who left at the end of the war, or we threw ourselves into the South China Sea at the peril of sharks and pirates, and we risked our lives to flee. Why did she take so long? So there was an immediate suspicion that, could she be a spy sent from the north? So she didn't have a welcoming reception when she was in Canada at first.
What a bizarre idea that, to us, someone who has become such a symbol of the war and the shame and the suffering should when she's finally reached the free world, be regarded as a spy. It says so much about the communist mentality.
Well,
or having grown up in this regime of trusting no one.
Yes. Well, in fact, it's after the book is out that others are willing to say, oh, all right, she was a victim.
My next question was indeed, how do Americans react to the book, to the story behind the picture, and is that also different from the way Vietnamese react?
Well, before the book came out in America, I was absolutely terrified, because the war holds such raw passions that I thought, I'm going to ignite it either end. I just can't win.
You can't do anything right when.
Yes, because my manuscript was sent by my American publishers to. It's what they call a free read. So someone's unconnected with the author, doesn't know you, and just reads the manuscript and offers their opinion. And the feeling that came back from 2 different people was, someone said, oh, this book will just further the right-wing agenda of the war. And then the other one says, this book will further the left-wing agenda of the war.
So did that make you stop worrying or worry more?
I did worry. But I think I have read that it takes 30 years on after the end of a war for people to rethink their experience of it, to be dispassionate enough to say, all right, maybe we can talk about it. And certainly, among my generation, those of us who had fathers that fought in the Second World War, often notes are compared, they just can't get their father to talk about it. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not 30 years going on for the end of the Vietnam War. But I think that it's beginning to happen in America. And it showed up in American reviews of my book. I thought there were very thoughtful commentaries from the reviewers themselves that said, did we not learn our lesson? This still goes on. Should we be reminded? Why does this go on? But as for the Vietnamese reaction, I don't know yet. Because I think the South Vietnamese community is very politicized in Southern California and in Canada. There will be some telling markers, if the picture were to go back up in a museum in Vietnam, if Kim were now to apply for a visa and it might go through. I sometimes wonder if I applied for a visa, would it be denied? Because I had skulked around Vietnam, because I had put people at risk, because I had taken my notes and tapes, left the country separately from me. I had broken the rules. So and this is the.
You took all the old-fashioned Cold War precautions.
Yes, but I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave the impression that it was all heroics on my part either, though. Because I remember that Peter Arnett said to me. He said, "It's a good thing you look Vietnamese." He said, "Because that will help. That will help a lot." He said, but he said, when you get to Saigon, he said, the first thing you do is you get rid of your Western clothing. and you go down to the market and you dress yourself like a person from Saigon. So I step off the plane, I head for the market, and I outfit myself in Donna Karan jeans, Calvin Klein tops.
I thought you were going to tell me you went and bought an ao dai.
No, there were all these designer knockoffs. It was great.
Cheaper than at home. But did the camouflage work?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
But isn't there something innately Western about just the frank look on your face that would give you away in a second?
Well, even during the war, when Saigon was...
I mean, I wore pajamas in India, but they could still tell.
During the war, Saigon was always more busy and more crowded, and people were bustling about and going their own ways. And it still is, it's crowded. Street lights change, but cars don't stop because, once you've got any chance of getting an intersection, you go for it. So, people are bustling about, and you can lose yourself in that. So, of course, I didn't interview in the countryside. Mm-hmm. I would bring people to Saigon. Mm-hmm. And in that hustle and bustle, you try to stay incognito. And you learn to check if you're being followed. Or it did happen when, I took precautions. I didn't keep my tapes on me, so when I would get a knock on the hotel room door and someone would say, who knew I was interviewing would say, I would like to put your tapes in safekeeping.
Right.
Well, I don't have any tapes, sorry. So even then it would happen, but I lost myself in the bustle, tried to lose myself in the bustle of Saigon. Mm-hmm.
And the people you spoke to, Kim's parents and neighbors and relatives, were they happy and relieved to finally tell their story, or were they very hesitant and anxious about coming to the fore with something that they had kept inside for all these years?
The most difficult interview I did, I'm reminded because I'm in the church, because I found the church where Kim was baptized. And to be connected with a church is still very dangerous in Vietnam, because you never know when authorities are going to crack down. So when I found a pastor, we went up and up and up into one of the rooms upstairs where just nobody would see us. And I was very worried that there would be repercussions. So that was very nerve-wracking. My stroke of luck in interviewing family and friends was my interpreter. Now, it wasn't all lucky because I found her, of course, unofficially. I'm hiring her. My US dollars, there's always US dollars that make these transactions. She hadn't spoken English in 17 years, so she wasn't the greatest interpreter. But my stroke of luck was that she had been on the rooftop of the American embassy the morning of the end of the war. She's waiting to be evacuated. She sees 7 stories below, behind the barbed wire fence, her estranged husband with their 2-year-old daughter. And she thinks, I can't leave. So she fights her way down when everybody's coming up.
Everyone's coming up.
And, of course, years and years later, she's regretted it ever since. She doesn't have a job. Her daughter doesn't have education. Her life has been, she doesn't have a decent place to live. She's on the losing side of the war. So she wants to help me. She wants to help me find the people. She helps me move from place to place. So that was my stroke of luck. But
so was this for her a way of redoing the decision, undoing the decision that she had made on April 30th, 1975?
I think in part measure, but I think that when you've stored, and after the war, people didn't talk about the war either, because when you're on the losing side of the war, you just keep your head down. So Kim and her family I don't think to this day they've talked about their experience in the war. It just wasn't, you just didn't talk about it. So people, I think when it's bottled up like that, and the torment is eating at you, I think they genuinely wanted to tell. So it became then my job to protect them from that risk-taking too, and from their own ignorance that we might be followed, or they might put themselves at risk, or that became my job too. But I think they did want to tell. They want people to know that war is horrible. I don't think there's any other conclusion.
Did it make a difference, do you think, even emotionally for the people that you interviewed, that you yourself were Asian, even though it was obvious that since you didn't speak Vietnamese, that you weren't Vietnamese? But was there some sort of bond?
Probably, although the Chinese and the Viet people have had a racial hatred going on centuries. And China and Vietnam have their own had their own war. Probably, when I think about it, my Asianness that helped was my reverence for food, how I like to eat. Because Vietnamese food is just absolutely seductive, and just tells so much about the history itself. In the French influence, the Vietnamese wrap everything in lettuce leaves, and they call lettuce leaves salade, for salad in French, and it's just truly seductive in the food. So I'm sure that helped.
I asked also because last year for my newspaper I had an interview with Maya Lin, the designer of the Vietnam Memorial, and she was a young girl, 21, when she designed the memorial, and as an architecture student at Yale. And the reactions from largely the Vietnam veterans were vituperative, that it simply could not be that their memorial was to be designed by a gook. That she was Chinese and not Vietnam didn't make one bit of difference. And I mean, that didn't serve as a bond in her case, on the contrary. But I wondered, in your dealings with the Vietnamese, also because they do have a difficult history with China, if they had indeed perhaps felt more comfortable with you, or...
Well, certainly, had I been a Westerner with a fair visage, and I couldn't have. There would be no skulking. It would be, it'd be too obvious. It could not have been done.
So even though I was jealous of your journalistic enterprise, I couldn't have done it.
I don't think so.
I'm so relieved.
In short order, a policeman would have pulled you aside, pulled out your backpack, and said, "What are you doing? What are these notes? Mm-hmm. What is this?" And without any further questions, it would have been gone. You would have been reported. People who would know what would happen to the people you had talked to. I mean, even then, I still was always worried. When I left the country, I had the only notebook I had in my backpack was I had this travel log, and I had glued in postcards and train receipts and noodle soup receipts, and recorded the weather, the temperature, and then I would write, I visited the War Remnants Museum today, and then 3 lines down in illegible scrawl, I preserved my note-taking, and then resumed near the end of it, and I went to see the flower garden at such and such. So I embedded all my notes because I was so worried that the tapes wouldn't make it. And so I still had to retrieve something. I had to salvage something from this trip where I thought I wouldn't do the book. So, even when you think you're safe, the discipline of fear is very powerful.
Was this one trip to Vietnam, or did you go back more than once?
Just once. One trip for a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did something similar in Cuba. But, of course, Cuba, and this is partly, the Latino attitude, it's a little looser. And because Kim is Vietnamese, so she's not Cuban, so there's less risk. But still, it's amazing to see that human instinct to do what it takes to survive. Because when I asked the Cubans about the special period, which is economic steep slide downhill and drives Kim again to think of this escape, when the Cubans came to talking about a certain person, they would just do this.
Oh.
And so so I would know when I got to talking about that person in my questioning, I would. So, the instinct is there to do what it takes for self-preservation.
Mm-hmm. This book is so much also about a strange period in my own youth, because in my very first passport, there was a list in the front page of where Americans could not go. Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea. Have you been to North Korea?
No, I haven't.
I wanted to ask you about not only the how of the book, but also the what. Is it journalism? And I ask that because I also want to ask, to what extent is it fictionalized? Are you not straining our credibility when you say in the beginning of the book, many of the conversations, or all the conversations with communist officials did not take place because I didn't want them to know that I was here doing this project, and many of these conversations are reproduced so-called verbatim, and are conversations that would have taken place 30 years ago. How do you know?
Well, I say in the book that these conversations and these officials are reconstructed from the memories of others. So I don't make up any dialogue. This is what people tell me they said. But I'm getting it third hand, of course, because of course had I interviewed any official, I'd have been kicked out. Mm-hmm. Just like that. It would have betrayed everything. It's the best that can be done, because until Vietnam opens up, you just won't get that. You won't be able to get that. You don't have that access. But nonetheless, I try to employ the journalistic technique ethic where I can, where I describe an official. I try to get at least two sources, two descriptions of him. I try to verify it, so that I at least I at least have the character right, and the conversations are limited, I think, because I by necessity I have to limit what I can. I think that in nonfiction, you have to write what you know. You have to know what you know to be true. Mm-hmm. So yes, but I think that's I make that up front, that is the best that can be done at this point.
Would you call this journalism?
Well, I think of journalism as what my husband's a journalist, so I remember a couple of book titles by journalists, and I think one was called History on the Run, and another was called The First Draft of History. So I tend to think of journalism as reportage. Whereas, for example, were I a journalist to go into Vietnam, I would have not been able to I would not have shed my Western outlook. Whereas to get at this story, I talked about turning things upside down. Mm-hmm. You have to do that, or you can't get at the heart of the story. You too can't have nightmares about war when you're writing the book, or taste fear in your mouth. So I think that's different than journalism.
And were you indeed ever to empathize with Kim, get some idea of what it's like to defect, or some idea to grow up under such a repressive regime, as you said in your talk? Could I achieve move into her place?
I think so. Yes. I mean, I think I think this is a necessity of writing it, at least what I see as writing, because, I'm the first one to say that you shouldn't listen to my advice, because writers are like, herding cats. It just can't be done. But I can't write with authenticity until I inhabit until I think as best I can. I can see her house. I can walk along the rutted path up and over the tree roots, and see the bamboo stems, and I can hear the mortar crump of the mortar shell. Until I've got all that, I actually don't think I can even start to sit down.
You said something, I think it was in the foreword, about thanking your interviewees for bearing with you while you made models of the village.
Yes.
With your children's playthings. What with Play-Doh or what?
No, I tracked down all the journalists who are still alive. I think but one, who was somewhere in Switzerland, I never could reach him, who were on the road on Tran Bang that day. And this is a good answer to your question, is it journalism? I track them down, and I travel around with a large Ziploc. Do you have Ziploc bags?
Druk en sluit.
And in it, I have Brio train tracks, curved and straight. I have little wooden buildings and trees. I have my children's Playmobil figures and a toy airplane. So I meet...
And little tiny napalm bombs?
No.
Sorry.
So I go to a Starbucks in Washington. I meet a journalist. We order coffee. I open my bag and I pour out all my toys on the floor. I set up, my train tracks as if it's the road through Tran Bang. I set the temple up, and then I give all the Playmobil figures and the airplane to the journalist. And I say, all right, show me. Journalists are trained to be observant. They have different versions of the event.
So what do you do then?
That's the power of memory. It's very powerful, but it's very flawed. And I learned that in writing the family memoir, because every member of the family has a different and often typically contradictory version of events. But it doesn't make it any less true. So, what is that during war? War is traumatic. It's an assault on memory. So you collect these fragments and you make judgments. So in that Reconstructing the Napalm Attack, finally, it was Fox Butterfield, the New York Times correspondent, who said, okay, I'll go up into my attic. And he came out 3 days later and he found the notebook from that day. Decaying, because in the Saigon heat alone, the paper would have decayed quickly. But so I rely mostly on his written notes on that day.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
Yes. No. She sold her book rights, which meant it was exclusive. She could not sell them to another publisher. But through difficult negotiations with her agent, I insisted that this was not to be an authorized biography. It was to be my own book. I would do with it what I wanted. And I'm glad I fought for that, which was weeks of negotiations, because it slipped to me. I'm telling tales here. It slipped out to me as I began the book, that originally it had been envisaged as a quickie biography.
Oh.
And I wasn't interested in that. And certainly...
You ultimately spent 5 years on this book, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not quick. And, if Kim were to hear me today, she would quake. She just doesn't like to hear communism mentioned. She doesn't like to hear the regime mentioned. She doesn't want to talk politics. She's still afraid. For practical reasons, she's afraid of her family in Vietnam and any vindictiveness the regime might have, but she cringes at it. So she would have, certainly when I conspired to not show her the manuscript until it was almost at publication, when it was really too late to change anything. And
all these journalist tricks.
yes, and she said to me, "Well, I don't want my brother to be in the book," and this is a brother who advises her to defect if she ever gets the chance. He's critical to the story, and it's just too much about the war in there. And I really don't want the communists mentioned. So
there's not much left,
no.
Is there?
So but this is another lesson about biography, I think. If I ever do another, I may not. Or not, maybe about a dead person. Maybe I'll do that. But, you cannot, a life is a life. You cannot capture a life in a book. It's separate. So this is what I say to young writers, too, that when you're writing a book, there's the life and there's the book. Ultimately, what you're doing is fashioning a text. And when you fashion that text, whatever you've conceived of the book and you've sweat blood to come to it, it will, you wrestle it to the page, flat onto the page. And if you've got it, when the reader reads it, it'll rise from the page larger than life. So I do think you have to separate what is a life and what is text.
May I introduce you, Willebers?
Since you challenged me and said that our minds should work during this interview, I, as a colleague, feel obliged to ask a question. Madame Chong, if you wonder where you are sitting, after redemption in the Protestant church, you go higher up. So that's why you're there. I was wondering, I have been in Vietnam, but I was wondering if there not is a difference of the opinion of the South Vietnamese in exile, like in Canada and Los Angeles, and the ones you found in Vietnam itself. Because it's my impression that they are much further with looking back at the war than the Americans themselves. And they are on a, that's why you were wearing those jeans. The question I have is how Kim avoids propaganda. She is now the ambassador of UNESCO. And how does she cope with this question of having fled the communist regime, having been used by the communist regime, having had problems with the Viet Cong, living as an exile in Canada? What is the lesson for her, and how does she act now in the world, and how is she able to be not on one of the two sides in her role as ambassador? Thank you.
Well, in the response to the first, are the South Vietnamese in the south of Vietnam further ahead in resolving, coming to peace with the past than Americans? I would say yes. Of course, they've, I read news reports and say, isn't it amazing? They love Americans. Well, they've always loved Americans. The enemy was, in fact, the North. So they never stopped loving the Americans. America continues, for whatever reasons, it's unresolved in the United States, including that they were defeated in a war they never declared. So when it remains unresolved, the torment goes on. And even in the way, for example, Americans continue to flog the issue of missing in action, whose remains have most surely decayed in the jungle in days, never mind 2.5 decades on. The South Vietnamese don't do the same. You're right. Now, mind you, it's the regime doing this, but what was once called the American War Crimes Museum has been renamed the War Remnants Museum. That's partly the regime, but are they further ahead? Probably. I think so. I don't know about this. I think it's different in the South Vietnamese community in California, however, because they're politicized. They have a political agenda. About Kim, I didn't shy away from my feeling that, as I confessed, I felt like a stalker myself. And certainly, isn't Kim doing the same thing? Even though she's part of the image, isn't she exploiting her own image? I was so struck by how Tracy portrayed her as having made a profession of it. But why is that? It goes back to the power of this picture. Because when you look at it, those who look at it, and you don't have to be of that era, when you look at it, it seems to, if you're directly involved in the war and you're tormented by it, and you can pay homage to the living symbol that is Kim, if she were to walk into this room, you would feel the physical effect immediately. Because what would happen? The image would flood your mind. You wouldn't see this woman. I've seen it happen. So if you're tormented by the war, paying homage to her is like, lancing that boil.
One more thing. You said that a journalist would always be back by 5 o'clock in the Continental Hotel for gin and tonic. That's almost true. But the best book of the war, in my opinion, is Dispatches by Michael Herr, and he stayed 3 weeks with the boys in the jungle.
So it can be done. It could be done.
It's a classic, yes.
Could you tell us, as we are winding down, and I hope in a moment there will be questions, what is Kim's life like now? What does her UNESCO work entail, and does she every now and then get out of her turquoise dressing gown?
Well, in most respects, her life is the typical refugee story, in that she arrives and steps off the plane in Gander, Newfoundland, Canada. She's only got the clothes on her back. Her little one suitcase is going around the carousel in Havana, unclaimed. And a few years later, she has a used car in the driveway, a modest townhouse, a washer and a dryer. Husband has 2 or 3 jobs. But it's not that typical, because the down payment on the house came when the Toronto Star newspaper ran a front page article, donations poured in. I helped her move into that house. On the day that she moves in, the washer and dryer arrives anonymously. Oh. She's a victim of goodwill as well, in other words. She travels the world for UNESCO, giving her, it's a voluntary position, and she gives a message of, she typically says this girl in the picture is, she's crying out in anguish here, in pain. But I've stopped crying out in pain now. I want to cry out for peace. So that's the tenor of her message. But she's no ordinary celebrity either. At the end of August, when I telephoned her, we were in close telephone contact, I phoned her to say what my summer vacation had been like. And I said, my husband and I took the 2 kids to the seaside and we swam in the ocean. I went to visit my mother. And then I paused and I said, and what have you been doing for your summer vacation? And Kim said to me, oh, Denise, I'm so excited. I've just had an audience with the Queen. Which in London, she'd been to help open an exhibit at the Science Museum, and the Queen was there, and she was granted a private audience. So, that's the end of my summer vacation story.
It was fun at the beach, yes, I'm sure.
Yes, but she's not. This is what you called an icon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Please.
I was wondering what your relationship with Kim is now. She read it, of course, in which she had not much to say. How did she react to that?
Well, she certainly travels with the book now on her speaking tours, and she's actually about to, in terms of a paid salary, she's about to go on a paid speaking tour in the United States. So she certainly has embraced the book, no question. I think when she autographs it, she writes, with peace, love, and forgiveness. God bless Kim Phuc. That's how she signs it. I can now leave aside, except when I do readings, my relationship with her as a writer. Because as a writer, you can never afford to like your subject. I think that would put you in great peril. Or dislike. You have to keep that distance. So now I have just a personal relationship with her. And I'm close to Kim because so many confidences were shared. I think I'm more in awe of her extraordinary mother. I'm very close to her mother.
Because her parents, for those who haven't read the book yet, her parents did come to join her in Canada, and that was when?
A couple years ago. They're only there on visitors' visas.
Mm-hmm.
They're applying for permanent residency status, but whether that will come or not is up to the Canadian government.
Are they happy there?
Well, Kim certainly thinks they're happy. The mother looks after her children when Kim is away on her speaking tours with UNESCO. Kim has converted her parents from their Cao Dai religion, which is a sect in the south of Vietnam, to Christianity. But I feel like I know the mother, and I feel that she hasn't, not for a second has she converted. I think she's, she is still at heart at home in Vietnam, although she's obviously kind of in exile from her home country. But there's nothing there in Vietnam. When I went to visit her mother and father in the south, they were in a bamboo hut that not even a stiff wind would have blown down.
So they left because the poverty was unendurable.
Kim wanted to help her family, help her parents. And she tried for years to get the Vietnamese government to agree to give her parents exit visas to come to visit Canada, and they refused. And it took intervention at a very high level in Vietnam to get the parents out.
Mm-hmm. Who?
Yes, would I be worried once the book comes into the hands of Vietnamese government officials? I don't know. I can only assume that they've read it already. I don't think I was incautious. I wasn't. I was very careful about what I wrote, in the sense that this was the regime keeps changing, it's become more liberal. Although from year to year, you hear that it's tightening up again, or it's loosening, or it's tightening. So, as the old guard gives way. But I think, I made sure that the officials I did write about are either retired, passed away. They were not, I didn't write about, except for one in Saigon, but I know he's well protected. And I talked about a foreign minister in the city of Saigon, and I knew that he got word to Kim through the diplomatic grapevine and through contacts in New York to tell Kim after she defected that he hoped she was happy. So I know it's okay there. But I had to make that kind of ethical judgment. Is it okay? And I hope it is. That's yes, although her brother does believe he is being fingered, because, of course, when you get into the provinces, the communist cadres in charge of the provinces don't have the savvy of Saigon and Hanoi, and there's more room for vengeance or vindictiveness. I mean, one of the people that I met who was close to an official in the province said to me, "You tell Kim Phuc to go back to Cuba." Well, I didn't want to break it to him, that just wasn't going to happen. So there still is kind of that prevailing attitude that, the state can tell you what to do, and you will obey.
I'd like to tell you something briefly about the documentary, the Dutch documentary that will be shown on the TV while the book signing is going on. It's important to know this. The documentary is to a certain extent a fake because, well, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a fake, it's been, it's sort of like a play that's been put on, a dramatization you call it here.
Yes, although the filmmakers don't know that at the time.
No, that makes it so interesting. They don't know that they're part of this whole deception of this image that Kim has to bring to the outside world from her minders. Kim went along with the dramatization. Yet again, she bared her burn back to her doctor and played the role of a medical student. She was no longer studying.
And she also didn't even have a doctor because she couldn't afford to have a doctor.
Yeah,